Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel for the third video and first racing video of the 2024 season. Today we're going to be having a little look at the Bahrain GP, looking at the free practice sessions, qualifying sessions and a quick mini race recap for anyone who may have missed some of the action this weekend, or maybe you're just looking for a little bit of a recap in general. I've got it all planned out and ready to go for you. Just a quick reminder, if you are new to this channel, do make sure to subscribe and leave a like. This helps to boost up my content to other people and I can make more of it and we can just keep it going. So first of all, a few pointers on Bahrain. It's a 57 lap long circuit. It's 5.412 kilometers in length, I believe, with 15 turns. It's a good track for overtaking. It's a nice way to start the season. It tests a bunch of different things to do with the cars. It's quite a technical track, and it's also quite weather inflicted. Things like wind can have big impacts on the cars, things like temperature as well. And we did see that a little bit over this weekend, which I will touch on as we kind of go through. High tide degradation in this track as well, again, to do with the warm conditions and also the rough track surface. It's quite horrific here. So a lot to kind of understand, taking the stuff that we learned from testing and then also moving forward, learning from free practice sessions as well. So what we'll do is we'll go through session by session, pick out the important bits, have a little chat about them. And yeah, so first of all, starting with free practice 1. So of course we saw Daniel Ricciardo go fastest overall here. P1 really was just a general warm-up for teams this weekend with little racing or quali data they could really pull from the results, or give them any real benefit, because this session wasn't really representative of the conditions that we were going to see in those sessions. So the main aim here, I suppose, would have been ensuring consistency from testing, so making those final tweaks we needed to get started with the season. This came in especially handy for teams like Red Bull, Max specifically, who appeared to be struggling with a couple of issues with his car in that first free practice session, had the opportunity to rectify those and get those fixed up. It's a perfect time really, because you wouldn't want them to happen in FP2 where we were going to see more quali simulations and stuff like that. So really FP1 in the first race of the season is for those little tweaks to be made. So it wasn't too much in terms of action and in terms of things that we can take. Now, most teams played around with the medium tyre in this quali session. That was expected. You did have a couple playing around in the soft though, so that would be the Racing Bulls, McLaren and Sauber. Hence why we had Daniel Ricciardo topping those timesheets with his lap, which is, great for him and shows some great potential with the car. But just, for anyone who's maybe new to watching free practice sessions, if this year's your first season watching F1, or you don't normally watch them and you may be surprised by seeing Daniel Ricciardo at the top of those timings, pay close attention to the tyres being used by each team in each session. It's quite important to, I guess, keep an eye on. You can learn a lot in terms of comparison to others this way, other drivers, other teams. You can learn a lot about what type of programs they're running on these sessions as well. Obviously, softs are going to do much faster laps on a well rubbered in circuit than mediums, especially depending on the time of the day and stuff like that. So said, I do feel like this session in particular set the Racing Bulls up quite nicely, at least in comparison to Sauber. If we look at those teams on softs, Sauber and McLaren being the other two teams, it was a good indication in terms of one lap pace where they were sitting in that midfield, and they did come out of it looking pretty strong. Obviously, Yuki and Daniel had the two McLarens sandwiched in between them. There wasn't really that much in it between Lando and Danny, but equally there wasn't that much in it between Yuki and Oscar either. So that was probably very encouraging for the Racing Bulls, taking from that and moving forward. Now, moving on to free practice 2, this session being the most representative of the quali and racing conditions, albeit cooler than expected. Now, I'll come on to that in a minute because it's quite important. So yeah, it was slightly cooler conditions than I think what teams were expecting. More teams in this session opted for soft tyres. This is where they'll be able to complete shorter one-lap stints for quali simulations, paired with a couple of longer race runs as well, which was quite nice. Hamilton obviously led the field in terms of those quali laps, with his fastest lap remaining at the top for the rest of the session. No one was able to beat that. George came in second, so things looked to be very positive for Mercedes. However, obviously looking in hindsight, we know that it may have been a little bit too good to be true. And I think when we take into account a couple of things, looking at Mercedes in that session in particular, we could have probably seen this coming. So two things to note. First of all, circling back to what I mentioned at the start of this little section about the track conditions and the track temperature being a little bit cooler than expected. Now, Mercedes generally are quite strong at getting tyres up to temperature. It's not something that they really struggle with too much. Red Bull are a team that struggles slightly more in this area in terms of getting tyres up to speed quicker. And so I think when we look at timings, that could be a big factor as to why on those one lap data simulations, we saw Mercedes do so well because obviously the conditions were a lot cooler than expected, but they were able to work with the tyres and get them up to temperature and put in those faster laps, at least in comparison to the Red Bull and like that of the Ferrari. Second of all, if we pair that with the suggestion made by quite a few people that Mercedes were running a fuller, more aggressive engine mode in that FP2 session, at least in comparison to Ferrari and Red Bull, it does start to make sense as to why Mercedes looked so good in FP2 and then they didn't quite make the same impact during the rest of the weekend. So take those things into account, I would say, when looking at free practice as well. Different engine modes and different temperatures, track conditions, all that kind of thing do obviously, as in a race, play a big role. Touching on a couple of other teams in FP2, especially as we're looking at things like quali practice in a way. Nico Hulkenberg, well, Haas in general, but Nico Hulkenberg in particular looked really good. There wasn't really much surprise there for me. I did say in testing that Haas don't really lack when it comes to quali. They had quite a few really good sessions of that last year, and so I wasn't really necessarily surprised to see Nico in particular doing well in that area. In comparison to the midfield, they were always pretty quick in that respect. As I said, again, in testing, longer laps would have been their priority to look at. And I will mention Haas when we talk about the race because there was a lot of potential there that I think wasn't fully realised, but at least in that FP2 quali simulation moment, they looked quite strong in comparison to one, what they were looking at themselves, and two, the other midfield teams. Perez and Piastri looked really good on those longer runs that they did complete, so that's great. A lot of valuable information there. Going into FP3 and quali on the next day, which was a Friday this weekend because we had a race on Saturday. Now, having a little chat about FP3, there wasn't really too much to note here other than the fact that Carlos Sainz was fastest overall. He looked great in this session. He looked great in all three sessions, really. Well, not necessarily great, but he looked strong in all three sessions. But he was able to really put the Ferrari in that top spot, which was nice. However, my main focus in FP3 was really on the other end of the standings, and that was Alpine. Alpine, I mean, they had a bad session. They had a bad qualifying, they had a bad race, but even just basing it on those figures, looking in hindsight, imagining we haven't had that quali in that race yet, Alpine looked weak. We kind of knew it was coming based on testing. I mean, Alpine just... Yeah, we need some big changes there. I need to have a little bit of a deeper dive into exactly what was going on with that car. I'd like to know. I'm quite interested just in general. But yeah, I think that Alpine really needs to make some big changes going into Jeddah because it's not looking good. And that said, like, I feel like last year they were starting to make a little bit of progress, but they've really regressed. I don't know what bad decision they've made with the car because a lot of the car is new. Again, if you don't really know what Alpine have done to the car, I've done a video on that. The first one I did was about the different car launches and the tech aspects of it, so give that a little watch. But generally speaking, there's a lot to be done there. Now, moving on to quali, I'm not going to go into massive amounts of detail on each of the sessions here just because we'll be here forever, but yeah, we'll start off with Q1. So Q1 we lost both Alpines. They finished 19 and 20, P19 and P20 overall, which is just, again, not good. The Alpines even last year weren't as slow as that from what I can remember, so not good. Both Saubers also fell in that bottom part, which I was kind of upset about. Logan Sargent was between the two, by the way, but the Saubers at least I was upset about because I think they showed a lot of potential in testing. I was quite interested to see how they'd get on in qualifying. I think in practice as well it wasn't too bad, so yeah, we can also kind of see that potential when we reflect on the race, but yeah, I was quite disappointed to see Sauber eliminated so early. So hopefully in Jeddah they can extract a little bit more and get a little bit higher up there because I am keeping a close eye on Sauber this season. I'm quite interested in them. That could be the Carlos Sainz fan in me looking out, thinking that he would potentially go to Audi. I don't know, but yeah, just worth having a little look on. But just a bit of a shame for the Saubers in general. Moving on to Q2, we then lost Kevin Magnussen, Daniel Ricciardo, Alex Albon, Lance Stroll, and Yuki Tsunoda. Stroll, Albon, and Ricciardo were all particularly close in that area if you look at the timings, but unfortunately not good enough overall. This did, however, mean that Nico Hulkenberg managed a Q3 appearance. Again, am I surprised, as I've just mentioned? No. I think that Haas generally, but also Nico Hulkenberg specifically, is a dark horse when it comes to quali. I think he does well in these situations. He is a very good. He's a quali merchant, really. Like he's just good at doing the qualifying runs, especially in the Haas. Yeah, I think there was never much doubt in my mind. I think it more stemmed from the fact that we didn't know how strong Haas were on race pace, but after looking at those practice sessions, I was expecting good things from Hulkenberg. So well done to him, and a great quali for Haas in general. Well, not so much Haas in general, but to be fair, Q2 and a Q3, I would say it's pretty good. Then focusing on that top 10, of course, we found Max on pole. Not really too much of a surprise there. We had Leclerc around him with around 2 tenths separating, so not as much as I thought there would be, but still, not quite there for Ferrari. But I'm pretty sure Russell and Sainz were even closer behind that. So there was a lot. There wasn't much separating the field when it came to that top 10. I think that the McLarens maybe would have wanted to extract a little bit more from the quali, but when we compare it to Bahrain last year, they're doing a great job. I just think that when we look at how strong the car was on the second half of the season last year, there's a bit of a difference. But Bahrain is a very different circuit. It's challenging, and McLaren historically have not been good in Bahrain. So I'm not surprised, and I think where they ended up was actually probably pretty good for them. And we also had Hamilton in 9th, which I guess kind of supported what I said about the Mercedes and FP2. I know George did a pretty decent job in quali, but Hamilton kind of fell off a little bit. And I think that based on the things that I mentioned earlier, there was a bit of a smokescreen in front of the Mercedes at that point in time. So a couple of things to consider there. Now let's have a little bit of reflection on the race itself, because there's a couple of different things that we can talk about. Now again, I'm not going to go into massive amounts of detail like lap 1, lap 2, because we're going to be here all day, but there are a couple of things that I really want to, I think, draw upon. So the first one, or one of the biggest bits of action, I think, for me, and I think this weekend, or not this weekend, but this race in particular, a lot of people did find quite boring. That said, I do think there is a lot that we can take from this race in terms of indications for the future. And the first thing that I want to talk about is, well, obviously Max winning, not just winning, getting a Grand Slam, led every lap, fastest lap, pole, won the race. Yeah, no surprises there, to be totally honest with you. I think if you were surprised that Red Bull were going to be performing that good, then I would ask you to check yourself, because come on, like, I don't think that there was ever going to be much different from last year to this year. I don't think that the cars have evolved that much. I think everyone's been trying to catch up to Red Bull, while Red Bull were 12 steps ahead. So I think it won't be until 2026 when we start to see big changes being made and we have new regulations coming in. I wouldn't be surprised if even next year we saw similar sort of disparities in terms of Red Bull. Next year could be slightly different because Red Bull obviously have gone with a slightly different concept this year, which we don't know if it's going to be sustainable or not, or if teams are going to start to develop in a similar sort of way, and how far Red Bull can take that and go with it, and what they can kind of exploit from it that other teams can't. We'll see that when we get there, but I think, this season was always going to be, in terms of Red Bull dominance, very, very similar to last year. If it's not something you like, sorry, like, it's just where we are. You cannot deny how strong Max is as a driver, and I'll touch on this a little bit more in a minute, because I'm going to talk about Ferrari for a second now. To begin with, in the race, Ferrari looked quite shaky, especially in those opening laps. It just wasn't great. Once they had kind of adapted into the race a little bit, made some tyre changes, got into it a little bit more, we saw a little bit more potential from both drivers. Obviously then Charles turned out with that brake issue in the end, which did put a massive hole in his race, which is really unfortunate for Charles, actually. One question that I had for Ferrari about this weekend is why they didn't implement team orders earlier. Carlos was on Charles's tail 3 or 4 laps before he made the overtake, and Perez wasn't too far ahead. I think he could have caught up a little bit closer, at least, to Perez at this point. So why wouldn't team orders not reinstated 3 or 4 laps earlier than Carlos was able to make the overtake? I don't really know. I don't really understand. I mean, whether they thought they could fix the issues or not, at least in the short term, in terms of catching up the pack a little bit more. Carlos had that potential, and I just don't really understand why that wasn't something that happened. It is what it is. The strategy didn't really even work out in Carlos's favour in the end as well, in terms of the overcut. So the strategy wasn't awful. It's not as awful as we normally see. It wasn't horrific, but it could have definitely been better. The car could have been better, but these are all teething issues that I think can be fixed. And I think going into Jeddah, when we have a slightly different track, looking at a faster track as well in general, I think we will see potential. I think this weekend did show a lot of potential for Ferrari. I think that they look a lot stronger, for sure, than last year. I think they're closer to Red Bull than they were last year as well. And I think Max really is the determining factor when it comes to Red Bull versus Ferrari at the minute, because in terms of race pace, they're not that far off of each other when we actually look at the raw pace of the car. It's more how Max is able to maneuver the car and make the tyres especially work for him. So when we're talking about exiting corners and going into certain corners, the way that Max does it is in a way that preserves the energy in those tyres a little bit better, whereas the Ferrari is a little bit more aggressive. So while we do see the Ferrari have potentially stronger corners than the Red Bull. The Red Bull is able to make stronger exits and are able to utilize their straights a lot more, which is obviously in turn makes them quicker and helps Max run away with the race a little bit more. Because when we look at Perez and Carlos, like there wasn't too much in it this weekend, I don't think. I think there was some teething issues that I think need to be dealt with, but I think going into the rest of the races this season, they're going to look quite competitive. So I am happy overall. I think that was a good result for them. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was Haas, specifically Nico Hulkenberg here. Now, I did mention this slightly earlier when we were talking about like qualifying, but I think that Nico could have finished so much higher if not for that collision with Stroll at turn one. I think that Nico had great potential, and I think this race was great for Haas in terms of the fact that they didn't struggle with their tyres as much as they used to, and they weren't struggling much more in comparison to their midfield rivals, which is a massive improvement for them. I think that if they can continue to push well in quali and not have issues like they did this week in the opening laps, I think they can really, really work to get up into those points, the bottom ends of the points, if not the bottom ends, at least challenging in that area for the first few races. And then when we have races that fall into their hands in terms of the car they've got, I think that we could see some good things from them. Now, obviously, when we look at different circuits in comparison to Haas, when we look at those more high speed corner circuits and stuff like that, I think they'll have a couple more issues, sort of situations where they might struggle with energy in those tyres. I think we could see some more problems. So I think Jeddah and Suzuka being our next two races, I think we could see some issues there, but not necessarily issues, but I think some more struggles. So I think Haas are going to have to work hard to get through that. But that said, I am interested. I'm definitely keeping an eye on Haas and specifically Nico this season because I think he's got some really good potential. So good for him. The next thing I wanted to touch on was Mercedes. Not a bad weekend, just not a good weekend. I would put it at like a 6 if I had to rank it. Now, obviously, FP2 was so strong for them. I mentioned why I thought that was earlier. I think it wasn't great. I mean, we had battery issues, we had overheating issues with the bodywork being too tight around the engine, and that lost them like half a second a lap, I think it ended up being, which is just detrimental when we look at where they ended, like what kind of happened. We had issues with Hamilton's seat. Like, I think Russell had some good potential to fight for those podium places to begin with, but once those cooling issues started, we just really couldn't see any positives coming out of the race for Mercedes in the end. I will say on a cleaner race, I do think that Mercedes do have potential. I think that the car will perform eventually. I just think that this just wasn't their weekend. I think they had too many teething issues to deal with. And I'd like to think that Mercedes can be a little bit more competitive. I just think that they're not, I don't know, they're just not being consistent enough. I think that Ferrari are really, it's too early to say at this point, but based on the first opening races of the season, I think that Ferrari are going to be the ones competing for those podium positions with Red Bull over Mercedes at the minute. I think they just need to be a bit more consistent in what they're doing and fix these teething issues because they're being detrimental to the race at the minute. I just want to really quickly touch on the racing ball situation that we had. Of course, we had that little bit of drama between Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo, with Daniel being on those softer tyres and wanting to make the overtake on Yuki, and Yuki saying, no, thank you, I don't want to do that. A bit of rivalry. Do I think it was a bit petty? Yes, I think Yuki should have let him go. I mean, Daniel's got fresher tyres. I don't it just it is a bit petty, and I think that sometimes drivers can get carried away with the fact that they are on a team with someone and they do still need to fight for the team. But I think you can only really start to be selfish when you're battling for the top ends. I think when you're sort of battling for the 1 point, but there's still other team members in front of you, and I know that Yuki would have really wanted that point, but I think if Daniel's on the fresher tyres, if you can get the point for the team, you let him go. You still got 23 races left this season, to make that up. So yeah, I do think that it was a little bit petty from Yuki. I do also understand why. I mean, I would be frustrated too if I was running ahead and then the last sort of few laps of the race I was told to swap. I get it. I hope it gets resolved. I think they're both at very critical points in their careers. We don't really know what's going to go on in terms of seats for them in future years. I think Daniel specifically is a a real crossroad here. Like, will he end up taking Perez's seat at Red Bull? Will someone else sweep in for that? Where's Yuki going to go? So I think they need to like nip that in the bud very, very quickly. I think things could get nasty. I think we always look at Alpine to be the team with the two teammates fighting, but it could be Racing Bulls this season. I don't know. So watch out for that. Now, just to touch on a couple of other teams. Yeah, Sauber, fine. I mean, Shogunyu, I think, had the potential to get up there in those points this week, so it was a bit of a shame that he wasn't able to achieve that. The pit stop for Bottas was absolutely abysmal. I don't even want to think about that. Again, I really hope that Sauber can be a bit more competitive in Jeddah. I did touch on them a little bit more earlier. McLaren, I think that Bahrain is just not a good track for McLaren in general. I don't think we're seeing McLaren's full potential. I think if you are a McLaren fan, or if you're someone who is monitoring McLaren, don't take their performance in Bahrain as their metric. I think that they're going to be a lot stronger in Jeddah when they're on a little bit more of a high speed track and something that suits their car a lot more. I would put this as a bit of a write-off. Not that it was a bad result, it was a decent result for them, but I think they would have wanted to get a lot more out of it, and I think they have the potential to get a lot more out of it. So yeah, watch out for other races in terms of McLaren. Aston Martin, a bit of a nothing weekend again. Clinching those final 2 points available this weekend. I think they were lucky to get there. They worked hard, they fought for it. I don't know. I just think that Aston Martin also needs to take a couple of big steps. And then Williams, a bad race for them. Issues with them, not surprised because Mercedes were having issues, so I kind of just assumed that Williams would probably have issues as well. Logan, I don't even know what was going on there. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about those teams because there wasn't much that stood out. I think that this race was just a race full of teething issues for a lot of teams. I think there was a lot of mini things that maybe didn't come up in testing, or because obviously in testing you're not actually doing a race. You know, it's just the first race of the season. It's your first opportunity to really run under the pressure of a race and racing conditions, all that kind of stuff. These things are bound to come up, and it's good that they're coming up for a lot of teams now so that they could fix them going into Jeddah and Suzuka, rather than midway through the season when it really counts. So I think those midfield teams are going to be grateful to see that. I think the teams towards the top, so like Mercedes, are going to be like, oh, I kind of wish I didn't get this, because they're going to be fighting from the start till the end. But yeah, I'm not surprised that we had as many teething issues as we did this weekend. That said, I enjoyed the race. I enjoyed the weekend. I always do, even when it's boring. I don't know. I just like seeing how things unfold. Our next race is in Jeddah, so Saudi Arabia. That'll be next weekend. And it's a Saturday race again, so don't forget that. We'll back to Sunday until we get to Vegas, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's where we're at. So yeah, I'd love to know what you guys thought of the race. Again, I said I enjoyed it. Not surprised about Max. Very happy about Carlos being on the podium, obviously, as a Carlos Sainz fan. I hope that Ferrari can give him more of a boost over the coming weeks. I think he has more to prove than Charles this season, so I hope that Ferrari allow him to do that. But I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. But yeah, that is the end. The lighting has gone really weird in here, I've just realised, because the sunset. Anyway, that is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed the recap. I hope you learned something. I'll be back in next week with the same sort of video for Jeddah. Hope you enjoyed. And yeah,